mind wandering was kind of made famous, I suppose, with James Thurber's famous story published in the late 1930s in the New Yorker. Most of you won't remember that story. I was aged about 2, I think, when it was published, called The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. So Walter Mitty has kind of become the mind wanderer par excellence. I think the story actually begins with Walter Mitty driving on one of the highways in the US with his wife beside him, imagining he's in some kind of Navy hydroplane facing a storm, and the particular soliloquy that he has ends with his wife saying, "Why are you driving so fast? Stop driving so fast." So that was an example of mind wandering taking over while he was driving, to the danger, I think, of both of them. In 1947, some of you may possibly have been around in 1947. I won't tell you how old I was, but I was alive and seeing movies. And it was a movie starring Danny Kaye and Anne Rutherford, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. Walter Mitty is actually entered into the dictionary. So Walter Mitty, I think it's in Chambers' dictionary, is described as an ordinary person who indulges in escapist daydreams of fame, power, etc., or simply an intrepid daydreamer. I want to kind of, daydreaming actually, mind wandering, has a bit of a bad rap. It's these days, people are all into mindfulness. So I want to give a little bit of an advertisement, if you like, for letting your mind wander from time to time. I think it can be quite good for you, and there's not much we can do about it anyway. Approximately half of you now, I think it's 46.9% of you, your minds will be wandering. Hands up those whose minds are wandering. You see, oh, well done, because normally you don't hear the question. There was a famous experiment done a few years ago from Harvard University where they actually attached or put apps into people's iPhones in something like, I think I've got it there, 83 different countries. And they collected this information from over 2,000 people. And what they did is they randomly kind of contacted them on their apps during their waking hours. So there you are, you've got your iPhone, suddenly it buzzes, and these people from Harvard have contacted you, and they asked you what you're doing. And in particular, if you're on the job, if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. And 46.9%, that's the percentage I gave you a moment ago, were not actually focused on what they were supposed to be doing. Their minds were wandering. So we are programmed, I think, to have our minds wander. We can't actually do an awful lot about it. Okay, so here's what they were doing. This is a very confused picture. So those are all the activities that they were engaged in while they were interrupted. I rather like the one right. Oh dear, I knew I would do that. My mind distinctly wandered. Now let's see if I can push that. It was also judged on a happiness scale. So they were asked to judge how happy they were on a scale from 0 to 100. And the happiness thing they were doing is right over there on the right, which is making love. And these are all the other things they were doing there. Now, what is interesting about it is that they declared that they were not quite so happy when their minds were wandering when they were on the job. And the title of that particular paper, which was published in Science, was "The Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." I think that's actually very unfair. So there is pleasant mind wandering is actually not quite as happy as when you're not mind wandering. It's only a slight difference. Actually, this is on a 100-point scale, so it's about there that's the neutral point. So on the whole, they were more happy than they were unhappy. So I think the title of that paper was a little bit unfortunate in saying that the wandering mind is an unhappy mind. And I think one has to agree that actually doing something is often more pleasurable than thinking about doing something. And I draw attention again to the one over there on the right. So, most of the time they were quite often in pleasant mind wandering or neutral mind wandering, and sometimes, of course, our mind wanders into unpleasant territory, brooding over bad things we did, or some remark we made we didn't mean to make, or a failed exam, or whatever. So, of course, that kind of mind wandering is not recommended particularly, but mind wandering, of course, can be much more positive than that, thinking about things you might be going to do and the like. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about the neuroscience of mind wandering. So one of the discoveries that came out of brain imaging research, which I do from time to time, is that the brain at rest is just as active as the focused brain. What we thought when we started doing brain imaging is that you can stick people in a scanner, see what their brains are doing, and then try and find out what their brains are doing when they're reading or when they were looking at faces or indulge in some task. And we thought we could take the brain at rest and subtract out the activity to see which parts of the brain are active for these different things. But the brain at rest is just as active as the focused brain. So that created a kind of technical difficulty. And that rather bad slide there shows the areas that actually decrease in activity during an attention-demanding task. So what happens is the brain is kind of active all the time. It wanders, and you get it to do something, you focus it, and the blood, if you like, in the brain, the blood flow goes to the parts of the brain that are involved. So the brain is a bit like a small town. If you have something like a football game or a game in town, then the people all go to that part of town, and the rest of the town goes quiet. But when the football game is not on, of course, there's activity all over town. So that creates some sort of difficulty in trying to analyze brain imaging stuff, and we're only just, in a way, getting used to that. Here are the aspects of mind wandering that are most analyzed or most researched. One is simply going back in time, autobiographical memory, thinking about what you did yesterday, what you did last Christmas, what you did when you were 19. So that's autobiographical memory, the ability to replay past events. And we call that autobiographical memory, or sometimes episodic memory, memory for the episodes, the things, the events of your life. We've come to realize that that's actually very similar to imagining the future thinking. And the bits of the brain that light up when we imagine the future are pretty much identical in many ways to the bits of the brain that light up when we imagine the past. So our brains, if you like, form a kind of continuum between past and future. And that, of course, gives us the concept of time. We exist in time. We exist not only in terms of what we have done in the past, but we exist in what we plan to do in the future. And what we are in one's present state of mind very rapidly becomes the past, or the thing that you're about to think you're going to do, like the sentence I think I'm going to utter next, very soon will be in the past. So there is that sort of continuity, if you like, between future and past, with the present there right in the middle. The other thing that lights up, interestingly, is what we call theory of mind. That is the ability to imagine that you're someone else, or to understand what other people think or other people believe. And if you like, that's a kind of mind wandering too. So we not only wander into the future, we wander into the past, but we wander into the minds of others. We're all hooked on TV soaps, novels, gossip, what other people might be doing. So our minds wander not only in time, but also into other minds. And of course, they also wander in place. So we have this large kind of canvas in which we allow our minds to wander that take us away from the present. So that's, I think, important. And incidentally, I think the whole purpose of language is to convey information about the non-present. So when you describe what you're doing, language is beautifully calibrated in order to talk about things that are not there. Okay, so those are some of the different components of mind wandering, and those examples there show you that the bits of the brain that light up overlap enormously. The big network that is responsible for mind wandering has come to be called the default mode network. It is that part of the brain, quite a large network within the brain, that is active during mind wandering, the default mode network. All right, let me just say a few things about autobiographical memory. That's the ability to relive past events. It's something we all do. We do it a lot of the time. We replay our lives. We write autobiographies, if we're really compulsive about this. We tell stories to our grandchildren about our lives that probably bore them more than we imagine. But we all love to, as it were, replay the past and inflict it on others sometimes. But we also create the past. A lot of the things that we think we remember and describe were in fact not true. Hillary Clinton is famous for having visited Bosnia, I think it was, and claimed to the press that she had to run as she stepped off the plane under gunfire and run for cover. But in fact, the TV cameras showed that she was actually greeted by a smiling child. So her memory of what happened when she landed in Bosnia was false. I'm sure she believes it, so there are lots of things about our own pasts that we seem to remember but that are not true. So the memory itself is a creative process, putting together not so much what necessarily happened to us, but what we would like to think happened to us. So we, in a sense, create ourselves by creating our memories. It's not quite as bad as that, of course. We do remember lots of things that are true, but we also embellish them a lot. The person who's most famous for having discussed this and written about it is Elizabeth Loftus. She appears lots of times in court to give testimony as to people's the reliability of people's memories. And she herself has a vivid description in her book of discovering her mother dead, face down in a swimming pool. She was visiting her aunt, and she remembers the scene very well. Her mother was lying face down. She remembers that there were sirens and ambulances came, and goodness knows what all, a very vivid scene in her mind. But in fact, she did not discover her mother dead in the swimming pool. She was asleep at the time, and this event was actually discovered by her aunt. So that's a very vivid example of a memory that turns out not to be true. So memories are also quite easily implanted. Elizabeth Loftus has done a lot of research showing that you can actually put memories into people's heads that were not there. So the important aspect of that is that this is the creative side of mind wandering. Sometimes it's mischievous, of course, pretending things happened that didn't happen, but it's also creative. We are creating stories, we're creating images of ourselves through our mind wandering into the past. So memory is storytelling, and storytelling is, of course, often memory. When we tell stories, write novels and so forth, we are relying also on our memories, and we're adding that constructive component. All right, now imagining the future, as Lewis Carroll, the Queen, remarked, it's a poor sort of memory that only works backwards. So we construct possible future events all the time. They can, of course, be creative. That's in a way what we're trying to do. We're trying to construct events that might work, to kind of pre-play possibilities of a dinner party, who you might invite, where they might sit, what you might eat, what people like, and so forth. So you construct the event in your mind in the future. Job interviews, you play those to yourselves before you go for a job interview. Wedding, where will we have it? Will I go through with it? All those sorts of things. The big game on Saturday, you kind of replay that, wondering how they'll turn out, whether the All Blacks will beat the Aussies yet again. And of course, future thinking is based on memory from the past, but located in the future. We can only really construct futures in terms of what we know and what we remember of our pasts. And of course, future memory is closer to fiction itself, because they have to be fictional. We are talking about things that have not yet happened, and we have to invent them. So what we now call mental time travel, the ability that we have to go back and forth in time, activates very similar parts of the brain. There's past events, they activate the parts of the brain you see on that left-hand image, and future events on the right. So the brain hardly knows whether it's in the past or the future. It does know, there are differences, but there's huge overlap in the brain circuits that are involved in imagining the future and imagining the past. All right, so time itself. So as I started out by saying a little bit, mental time travel links future and past, and therefore gives us the understanding of time, the concept of time itself. And we're utterly obsessed with time as humans. I've been told that I mustn't go over time, for example. We have clocks and watches and calendars and appointments and anniversaries and festivals, nanoseconds, microseconds, seconds, hours, days, weeks, months, years, decades, centuries, eons. We measure time in all sorts of different units. To particularly critical points in time, life and death, when we were born and when we die. But we can also imagine time, of course, well beyond those things. Physicists tell us they know when the universe began. So we can actually stretch our concept of time way, way back and way, way into the future, when I believe the sun will gobble up the earth, and that will be the end of time for us. So time, I think, is in a way what creates the self. Without the notion of yourself through time, you would hardly be yourself. And I'm going to illustrate that a little bit. The hub of mind wandering is the part of the brain known as the hippocampus, which I think Barbara mentioned very quickly. It's called the hippocampus because it's shaped like a seahorse. So there on the left is the hippocampus in the brain, and on the right is the seahorse, and it's obviously called the hippocampus because hippocampus is Greek for seahorse. So it's a structure that lives behind your ear there, and it is the hub of mind wandering. I'll explain that in a little bit more in a moment. So that's actually a two-part organ. There's a left branch and a right branch, and it sits there behind your ear in the temporal lobe, and it is what organizes your future and your past imaginings. When I say it's the hub, it's not where these things are contained. These things are contained in the brain, in the different lobes of the brain that look after audition and vision and proprioception, the things that Barbara talked about a bit. Our memories are implanted through the brain, but it's the hippocampus that kind of is the hub. It's like a grand central station, if you like, that kind of allows you access to your memories and access to your imaginations. And without the hippocampus, we are pretty much lost in time, and I will illustrate that. So it lights up when you remember things. That's the posterior part of the hippocampus. When you imagine the future, the anterior part. So within the hippocampus, there's a kind of differentiation between past and future. So the brain does know what's in the future and what was in the past. And hippocampal removal or destruction, if you lose this particular organ, one of the most important organs in the brain, then you basically lose the ability to remember anything, any event that happened, and the ability to imagine the future. That's roughly the little bit of imaging that we did in our lab. One of the students, Victoria Martin, did this. And these are the little parts of the hippocampus itself that light up when you imagine the future or imagine the past. Okay, so if your hippocampus is destroyed, and there are some unfortunate cases out there where the hippocampus was destroyed, in which you lose memory of the past and can't imagine the future, and basically your mind can't wander. So people with this condition basically have minds that are stuck in the present and cannot wander. A famous example is Clive Wearing, who is a British musician. He worked for the BBC, but he was quite a prominent conductor of music, did a little bit of composing. I believe he also organized all of the music when Charles and Di were married on BBC Three. He was organized the music, and shortly after that happened, he had his hippocampus destroyed from a herpes virus infection. Normally there's a blood-brain barrier that keeps this virus out of the brain, but he was unfortunate enough to have it invade his brain, and he got progressively worse until they figured out what was going on, and then they managed to sort of stop the infection. But meantime, it had destroyed his hippocampus. His wife, Deborah Waring, wrote a rather nice book on this called, understandably, Forever Today, because he's always in today. And here's a quote from that book. By the time they had figured out what was wrong with Clive and started pumping the antiviral drugs into him, all he had left were seahorse-shaped scars where his memory used to be. So that's a striking illustration of the role of the hippocampus. He's unable to remember any event from his past. He can still play music, incidentally. He can still conduct a choir. So one has to make a distinction here between memories for events, what we normally think of as memory, and habits, skills. So he retains the skill of speaking. He can recognize his wife, he can recognize his children, but is astonished at how old they have grown because his memory of them goes way back. So his skills, basic skills are there, but he has no memory, no timeline, no conscious timeline that he can refer to. I think he was referred to by a BBC documentary as the man with the 7-second memory. So he's got enough of a window of time, what's called short-term memory, to be able to begin a sentence and complete it, but having completed the sentence, he kind of can't remember it anymore. Playing cards, they tried to get him to play patience, I think, and he would lay the cards out and then couldn't figure out how the cards got laid out. So he often gets engaged in a task and moments later can't remember how it happened that the task was there. So he does seem to live in a second window of time. In a way, a more famous example is Henry Molaison, who's been known in the literature for 30 years as HM, who had his hippocampus removed surgically for an intractable epilepsy. And in those days, they didn't quite realize the impact of removing the hippocampus. So he had temporal lobe removal for epilepsy, but in the course of that removal, his hippocampus was bilaterally removed, so he was without a hippocampus. And he, again, has loss of autobiographical memory. Actually, he died a couple of years ago, so he doesn't have any memory now, but all his life he was studied by actually a former graduate student that was in the same department as I was at McGill when I was there, called Suzanne Corkin, and she studied him for something like 30 years, and he never got to know her. Every time he had tests that she would do, she had to introduce herself anew and explain who she was and what he had to do. So he was unable to form a new memory of her. He does have, or did have, I should say, some childhood memories from way back before the operation. So sometimes these people have stuff that goes way, way back. But basically his timeline was gone. He can learn some implicit skills. Like Clive Waring, he can talk, or could talk. So his basic skills were there, and he could actually learn new skills, strangely enough, like mirror drawing. So this is tracing a star, but you can only see your hand tracing the star in a mirror. And that's quite hard to do, because you've got to move your hand forward. If you see your hand moving forward in the mirror, but in fact it's moving backwards, and you've got to replan the way you trace this thing. And he learned to do that quite well, but was astonished that he could do it. So he would sort of say, oh, that should have been difficult, he would say, but I seem to do it. So implicit skills, motor skills can be learned, because that's not quite the same thing as what we've called autobiographical or future thinking. So memory is complicated. So skills can be retained by these people, but not their memories, and nor their future plans. And when Suzanne asked him, "What do you think you'll do tomorrow?" He was a very obliging fellow. He said, "Whatever is beneficial." That was his reply to lots of things. So a nice fellow, loved being tested, actually. In a way, he was an example of you take away people's mind wanderings and they're happy. He was a happy guy. Didn't have anything to brood about in the past. Now, the hippocampus has also been known for a long time. Again, this was discovered by a couple of colleagues of mine when I was at McGill, John O'Keefe and Lynn Nadell. Wrote a book in the 1960s called 1970s, I think, The Hippocampus as a Cognitive Map. So the hippocampus was understood until moderately recently as not a time machine, but a space machine. So particular neurons in the rat hippocampus respond to particular locations. So that if a rat is in a maze, you can tell where the rat is by which particular neuron or cell in the hippocampus is firing. The animal moves around and another cell will be active, and so forth. So the hippocampus, they described it as a cognitive map. And the particular neurons in the hippocampus are known as place cells. So the hippocampus is also a kind of GPS system. It kind of tells the rat where it is in the maze. So it was known for a long time as simply as a cognitive map. Right. This is true also of humans. There's now been quite a lot of work with brain imaging showing that there are similar cells in the hippocampus that tell humans where they are in space. London taxi drivers, they have to know London more or less like the back of their hand. They must know any route in London. If you take a cab in London, they've got to take you where you want to go without consulting a GPS system or a cell phone or phoning base. They are tested on this. It's known as the knowledge, and it was established, I think, in 1865. And the hippocampus in London taxi drivers is enlarged. So the hippocampus has enlarged. This is an example of neuroplasticity, by the way, the hippocampus being enlarged to deal with this problem of learning this immense spatial detail of the City of London. Obviously not, yes. Okay, now we also know now that in the rat, the hippocampus also underlies mind wandering. So not only does it code space, it also codes past space and future space. I like to call this the secret life of Walter Ratti. So recordings from the hippocampus, as I've just told you, they will fire wherever the rat is in a maze. But you take the rat out of the maze, maybe half an hour later, and you record from the hippocampus, and it's replaying trajectories in the maze. So its mind is wandering back to the maze. So we now think mind wandering. Some years ago, I argued with a colleague of mine that mind wandering was uniquely human, that only humans have a concept of time. Only humans can replay the past and pre-play the future. But I've now become convinced from this research that this is something that's built into our brains and goes way back in evolution, so that even rats have this particular ability. Now, some of the trajectories that are mapped out, so the rat is no longer in the maze, it's out of the maze, and it will play these little trajectories, but as often as not, they are not trajectories it actually took. Sometimes they're the reverse of a trajectory it took, and sometimes they're a completely different trajectory. So in other words, they seem to be imagining possible future trajectories in the maze. And that's probably adaptive, because in the course of doing that, they're, in a way, setting up the maze inside their heads for possible future activities. They are planning. So this business of mind wandering is built into our brains, whether we like it or not, and rats do it too. It also happens, incidentally, when the rats are asleep and presumably dreaming, but sometimes when they are awake but just seem to be daydreaming, as a lot of you perhaps are doing right now. I won't ask you again. Here's an example. I'm not sure whether I can explain this very well. I've only got 49 seconds to do it in, oh dear. So here is a rat. It's about, this is a maze it's running along, and when it's at the beginning of the maze, it's the blue areas that light up, coded blue. This is the cell number in the hippocampus itself. So here it's these particular cells are firing because it's at the beginning, and as it moves along, the cells change their firing, so these then to be the cells toward the end of the maze. And they're firing before it gets there, incidentally, but that's the trajectory that it actually is taking in the maze. But notice over here, before it actually runs the maze, it pre-plays it. In other words, it plays the trajectory in its hippocampus right there, but very fast. So here it is kind of blown up so you can see it in time, but the actual imagined trajectory is fast. And here at the end, it replays it backwards. So here, in other words, it started at the end and it's moving toward the beginning, but again, very fast. So that sort of says that its mind wandering, its mental trajectory, is much faster than its actual trajectory. And I think we do that too when our minds wander. If I imagine myself walking to work, which I occasionally do, it takes about an hour, but I can do it in about 20 seconds in my mind. We don't really yet know whether that's because we flip from one place to another or we just kind of mentally speed up. But there is a thing about mind wandering that it's fast, and it seems to be faster than the actual activity. Now, I've actually been my light is flashing down there, so I'll just see if I've got other stuff I should tell you. Oh, that's another example of the rat was taken to different points in that rather complicated environment on the left there, and it actually played its route home to the red thing, where it was to find food, in advance of doing it. So there are also experiments very similarly done of how we wander into the minds of others, brain imaging experiments again. Oscar Wilde's quote, I should at least give you that, be yourself. This is a good piece of advice. Everyone else is already taken. All right, so that's an experiment again on understanding false beliefs in others, showing the same parts of the brain lighting up, and the hippocampus, again, is in charge of that, the ability to move yourself into other people's minds. I'll just say a little bit about dreams, because Barbara mentioned dreams, but of course our minds wander in dreams whether we want them to or not, often in bizarre fashion. So of course dreams do not recreate your past. They may have to do with kind of consolidating your past in memory, but our dreams are scrambled versions of the past, again with this creative aspect. Hallucinations do the same thing. People through the ages have taken drugs to give themselves hallucinations in order to increase their creativity, in order to have bizarre images that might prove useful when they're writing or painting. Earworms, perhaps I'll stop with earworms, because earworms are those tunes that get into your head when your mind is wandering, when you're on the plane traveling somewhere and you can't get rid of them. They're called earworms, tunes that won't go away. So these are examples, dreams and hallucinations and earworms, of mind wandering that you don't have control over. In other words, your mind just kind of takes over and wanders. But of course, in other kinds of mind wandering, we do have some control, and you can use mind wandering to plan and the like. Thank you very much.